welcome for another edition of The Final Mile, where we answer your questions that you send to us every single week. Make sure to check out our sponsors to support the channel. And if you'd like to learn more about Freight 360 and our training options, check out the Freight Broker Basics course, a self-paced course taught by us, where we teach everything from how to start a brokerage, get new customers, grow the business, and even hire the right employees. So today, our first question comes in from Hunter. He asks, are freight agents allowed to work or contract with more than one broker at a time? So if brokerage A does not want to move that load for whatever reason, such as extending credit, etc., I can go with brokerage B. This is actually a good question.
It's a very good one.
Usually, yes, you can. It depends on what your contract says, though.
Do you have an exclusive or a non-exclusive contract with the brokerage you're an agent for?
And I've seen both, okay? I've seen non-exclusive agreements and I've seen exclusivity clauses. Now, I'll tell you where I've seen it work and where it's not a good idea. So about 6 years ago, I had a guy that was an agent with a truckload brokerage for all of his full truckload, and he was an agent with an LTL brokerage for all of his LTL business. No conflict of interest. There's no way that one of the loads could have went through either company. It was very cut and dry. There was no issues. And I think that that's fine. Further, I think it's actually smart. I've even seen people that they'll be an agent for a freight forwarder, so they can handle international business through one organization and domestic brokerage through another. Here's where it gets sticky and messy, right? He mentioned credit lines. So let's say one company gives $20,000 in credit to a customer, and they run it up and they go run it through another brokerage. You're going to have invoices get mixed up. It just gets, invoices get screwed up. You're getting emails from the wrong email address and stuff like that. I've even seen it where whatever company has a better payout on certain loads, they'll run all their crap freight through there because they're looser on it. And then the ones that require a certain margin threshold to get paid a certain amount, they'll only run their good high margin freight through that one. So it's kind of like one company's getting the short end of the stick and the other one's, not. So unless you have a compelling reason to do that, I would not recommend contracting as an agent for more than one company.
I agree with everything you said, right? And the thing I would go more on is that, like, if you're running into credit issues, yes, it is a company's protocol as to what credit they will allow. And that's kind of subjective in some ways where they're just not comfortable extending it. But you are really putting yourself in a very risky position with that customer when you are running loads through two different brokerages for the same one, especially if it's a credit issue, because there's a reason that's happening, right? And in my opinion, you're far better served, and so is your customer, to go back to this brokerage and try to find ways to get them more credit to help them, as opposed to trying to end around one brokerage to work with the next. Because again, it just creates way more headaches than I think it will ever solve. And if you're really just trying to increase your profitability, you should just be bringing in more customers. And that to me is avoiding the hard reality of you've got to prospect more to bring in more business. You shouldn't be looking at how can you just squeeze more out of what you have, because it's making all of it more risky and more difficult.
And I'll add in lastly on that point, ideally, if you're a freight agent, you should try to find a company that you can have a true partnership with for the long term.
Yes.
I see too many agents that hop from company to company every 6 or 12 months because they run into issues with credit with bad customers, or they didn't talk about a certain thing beforehand, like, oh, my customer expected to have 60-day terms. Well, we didn't know that. You never told us, and now they look to be slow paying. We can't extend them any more credit. Or this customer requires X, Y, and Z with their invoices for billing purposes, and we never told, no one ever told the accounting team, and now they're behind on carrier pay and getting collected, invoices collected on because they never got ahead of it. You should do a very good job vetting a company and make sure you explore all the different situations and scenarios that could pop up to make sure that everybody's on board. Okay. So that's my take. It is not easy to move a book of business, right? Some are easier than others to move, but it is a lot of work to switch all that over, and you don't want to bounce around every 6 months or so.
It's also not a good look from your customer's point of view, right?
Yeah,
It's like,
there's that
okay,
too.
I
Yeah,
mean, I really like working with you, Nate, but isn't this the third company we've been invoicing and as many years? And it's like, okay, at a certain point, like you've got to have some consistency, right? Like
yeah,
we don't need to go too much further into that, but I think that was a really
yeah. That's absolutely right. All right, next up, Maysa asks, I'm looking to change our insurance company. Any recommendations for a good one? Well, what I'll say on this is I think that it is a good idea to go through an insurance broker whenever you're shopping for rates. And it's always a good idea, even if you've had the same insurance rep for 15, 20 years, you should be shopping around every year or so just to keep your provider honest, right? They don't necessarily have to be the bottom cheapest option for you because they might offer you great service and other things that don't have a price tag on them. But you need to make sure you're within the playing field. You're not way out on an island there with your rates just being crazy. So what insurance brokers can do, the same way as us as freight brokers can go shop motor carriers and figure out the best option, an insurance broker can go shop insurance carriers that will actually underwrite the policy and give you good options. And some of them might have different ways of writing a policy for contingent cargo versus contingent auto versus general liability. And the list goes on and on and on. What's your thought on insurance?
yeah, same. And I'll shout out to a guy. I've done his show, and I think he's been on ours. We've had Cameron Pescia on our show, haven't
Yep.
we? Yeah, and he owns Valley Trucking Insurance. You can go to his website at valleytruckinginsurance.com, or you can find him on LinkedIn. But again, really well knowledged, been in the industry a long time, and is a broker and somebody you can also look at to get some rates and to, again, compare and get an idea. Because even if you've been, I think, just to reiterate, right? Like, even if you've been with just a carrier, right? It's good to work with a broker to keep the carrier honest, right? To just make sure you're paying in line with what everybody else is. And these things change a lot. And right now, I mean, I've had a lot of insurance calls this week. We talked to LoadShore, which is another great product out there. If you're shipping things that are in different values and you need spike insurance for things. But you really want to understand it. It's a big cost to your brokerage and your customers. This is a value add to your customers, not really a necessity, I think, for the brokerage is really the way I look at it, right? Like you're buying this to mitigate the risk of cargo loss for your customer. You also don't want to just know what are your coverages and what you're paying. You really want to know, like, are they going to be there if you need them? And you want to have some conversations with whoever your agent is or your representative to, hey, okay, like this is my contingent and this is my general policy, but like, what does this really cover me from? And what are the instances where it would actually pay my customer should something go wrong? And where are my gaps? Where are my holes? If something happened, where am I not covered? And how do I mitigate that risk? Because maybe you use, better performing carriers on some of your higher value freight. Maybe you're, looking more into who you're booking on these loads based on where your coverage is. Or maybe you're spending more on coverage and you can use a marginal carrier where you might not because you maybe feel a little better about that risk, right? And those are just some general ways to look at it, but it isn't just a necessary bill for your business. It's also something that is protecting you and your customers' commodities.
Agreed. And there's another episode that we did with Melt Godwin from TI Advisors all about insurance. I don't think he's even I think he made it pretty clear he wasn't taking anyone new on. He's later in his career and he's got a good book of customers right now, but a great conversation. He peeled back a lot of layers on risk and diversifying your insurance coverages and policies. So check that one out.
I've probably sent that episode. I sent it to 3 people in the past 2 or 3 weeks, actually. And it's probably one of the ones I send the most because he's been in it so long that he really understands the ins and outs of how these things work. And when you listen to somebody explain it, it will give you better insight into the questions you can ask of your person handling your insurance.
Yep. Exactly. All right, next up, Lucky asks, what causes unhappy sales reps? I've been seeing a lot of posts about discontent sales reps at big 3PLs. What's the attraction to join those places and what causes you to want to leave? Good question. And it's going to be different for a lot. I mean, elephant in the room, you tend to hear in a lot of forums online, like TQL tends to have a lot of people that are just salty. That's not to say that they're not a good company. I think that the kind of business model that a company has doesn't necessarily align with the goals or way that somebody operates as an employee. So, like, for example, the big box brokerages, by design, they want to hire in a large quantity of sales reps and find the ones that can really get their feet held to the fire and produce under stress of high goals in a short amount of time and a lot of new knowledge tossed at them. And there's, because of that business model, there's going to be turnover in those that don't make it. So people might say that they're unhappy when they want to leave, but the reality is they're going to probably get pushed out the door before they have a chance to leave if they don't meet those goals. Now, on the other side, toxic leadership and lack of communication, to me, are two really big reasons why people might be unhappy in freight brokerage or any company in general. If your boss is hiding information from you and not being transparent, they're doing you a disservice, right? If you have a boss that is clearly a drug addict or doesn't show up and lead by example, that's a toxic leader. If you have a boss that allows gossip to go around or favoring one person over the other, it's a bad environment. What's your take?
Yeah.
I know I kind of bounced around a little bit between the big box and just other companies, but what would you say makes people discontent in this industry in sales?
Well, I did a video on this too a couple of weeks ago, what it's like working at a big box freight brokerage. And I've worked in a big box and I've worked outside as a consultant into a lot of the larger ones. And again, I'm going to answer it from the positives first, right? And the question also asks, like, what attracts people? Well, what attracts people is you're going to get paid to show up, which means you aren't going to work waiting to sell before you get paid, right? So you're going to get a salary and you're going to have some security. You're going to have training. You're going to likely have some insurance and 401ks. You're going to have exposure to a lot of different industries and a lot of people that have experience that you can learn from. That is one of the biggest ones, right?
That's huge.
You're going to have the weight of that company behind you as a brand and a recognized brand in the industry to be able to sell those services, right? Those are all big advantages, right? Now, drawbacks. One of the biggest drawbacks is to get a lead in your name before you can call them is very, very difficult, because the first line isn't just, I got to find a prospect to call them and convince them to want to work with me in this company. The first is there are 5,000 or 6,000 other salespeople that already have 80 to 150 leads in their name that they're prospecting. Well, take 5,000, 6,000 times 150. That excludes a lot of companies that you cannot go after, even if you might be a personal fit to work with them, because somebody else is already doing business with them or is prospecting them. So again, it makes it far more difficult to get a lead to want to work because of that competition. But you've got the other advantages I've just outlined, right? The others are, you do have some uncapped commission at a lot of them, but it's not really uncapped, right? Because again, even though you might have business coming in and scaling, you still need internal approvals to hire more people on your team to service them. And you can't just go and independently take the money you're generating through your own book of business to hire people when you need to, where you need them. That is all decided somehow by either metrics or benchmarks that you hit that do allow you to scale, but it is not the same as if you're doing this as an agent or if you're working at a smaller brokerage, right? And the other thing too, right? The bureaucracy of it. There's going to be more rules. There's going to be more regulations. There's more people to manage. So again, you have a lot clearer lines in who's and what lane and what you can and cannot do, right? That keeps, I think, a lot of people in a large group working together in a way that functions, but it does create a lot of inflexibility when you want to do things outside of the norm, right? And again, I've always had the opinion of, well, if everybody's running in this way, I want to look for opportunities going the other direction that nobody's looking at. And that's great because I'm now by myself. The downside is these large companies aren't always on board with wanting to do something they've never done for obvious reasons. It's much harder to get them to make these decisions. And even when you can prove that they are, to get the entire bureaucratic machine to get behind you to support you in the way you need to do them takes far longer in a big company.
Yeah.
And again, like those are some of the reasons they leave. And I will say the last one, which is probably why most people leave, is they get customers, they build a book of business, they build a team. And to be honest, whether you're in a big company or not, most of those people stop prospecting. And then what happens is after a year or two, and if you're lucky, maybe it's 3 or 4 years, something happens with that customer. They get acquired, your rep leaves, they buy a brokerage, 100 different things that you could lose that relationship for. And once they lose it, they lose all of their income. And now they got to start back as I've got to go and hustle again and prospect. And I got no money coming in. I don't even have the $20,000 or $30,000 checks coming every month to keep me happy to go to work. I'm now getting my base paycheck of $3,200 a month, and I got to do the hard job again. And most people just don't sign up for that. They're like, you know what? Had a good run. I'm not going to do this again. They leave and they're angry because they're like, well, I could have done this, but someone else is working with that customer. I'm just wiping my hands, and then they blame everybody else.
Yeah. I mean, back to your point on bureaucratic, trying to get somebody to change their mind on the way they've done it. You know, the whole 6,000 person company's done it for years. Well, I personally absolutely love organizations that are not like that. So I started off with a very, very large asset-based company, thousands of people, hundreds of locations. And I went to corporate twice, and I probably got to saw the CEO's office, but he wasn't there or whatever. Right. Whereas the 2 brokerages that I've worked for, I knew the owners. Like my boss is the owner right now, the company that I work with. It's amazing. So if there's something that's out of the ordinary that we've never done before, I don't have to run it up a chain. I just have a conversation and say, hey, we're not doing this yet, but here's an opportunity, and here's a few different courses of action. And if we do this one, here's the risk. If we do this one, here's the risk and benefit. And this, you can't do that it's not that it's impossible, but you can't do it as easily in a large corporate environment.
Yep.
So I remember we had an issue when I worked for the large trucking company, and we had a customer that had issues with how some of their stuff was getting damaged when it came through a certain facility. So working with an account manager, trying to figure out what can be done differently to help resolve X, Y, and Z. And basically they were like, no, this is not how, this has to go up through this rep's branch, through regional, then down to our branch. You can't just try to intercept human to human from 2 different branches and solve a problem. It's like, why not? It's way easier that way. Let me talk from my location to his location and figure out what we can do better to make this relationship, fixed. But yeah, so it was frustrating. But I didn't last there more than a few years.
I can give you one too, another example of that drove me nuts. I mean, I established at one of the bigger companies, our relationships in drayage with the major steamship lines. Well, under those contracts, we piggybacked on their master chassis agreements, right? And chassis are all rented, and there's 3 companies that own them in the US. And we use theirs, right? So that they got billed for the chassis usage. But I met the reps for the major chassis companies like DCLI, and the point was they came back to us, right, at the big company and go, we'll negotiate a chassis agreement with your brokerage so that you can have the same discount across every customer you move. And we ran the numbers, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit that we were leaving on the table by not moving into this master agreement where we were basically paying the chassis fees directly. And it was not that it wasn't profitable, not that we couldn't manage it, and not that it was even risky. It was just getting everybody to agree to actually do it that we just never could get it done. I mean, years of just watching thousands of dollars a day, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars a week. We're just paying exorbitant bills for no reason other than we couldn't get everybody to agree on how to actually implement something that would have made lots of money.
Wild. Yeah, that comes with a larger company, just the way it is.
Is what it is.
All right. Wolf asks, a trucker is sharing GPS location and timing as proof for detention. The receipts mention the check-in time, but he is claiming 4 hours of long lines before checking in and seeking 5.5 hours of detention. The GPS data does not identify the truck. What's the best way to deal with this? All right, so let's break this down. They're trying to get detention and saying that even though it says I showed up at certain time, I actually had to wait an extra 4 hours just to get in to check in. Best way to deal with it. I don't know.
So wait a minute. Can I ask you something? Does that mean they're saying that like the GPS doesn't show them at the facility? That's what I'm a little confused with. Like, because if they're in line to check in, the GPS should show them like on site, even though.
Well, I think that's what they're saying is the GPS shows that they were there, but their check-in time on their ticket
at the gate
gate was 4 hours later because there was obviously this is probably like port congestion or some kind of facility congestion. So here, there's no right or wrong way to do it, but probably per contract, they're not owed detention because they weren't technically in the facility yet. But if your customer had a really weird day with a lot of stuff like this, they might be willing to pay some detention. You also might just want to give that carrier a bit of a break and pay some out of pocket for that one load because put yourself in their shoes. Imagine if you got hired to go do something for somebody and before you could even walk in the door to start the job, you had to wait for 4 hours outside the door until they had enough congestion fixed for you to be able to go in there and start the job. Your customer's not guaranteed going to pay it, but you may want to just do that carrier solid and take care of them, especially if they're a good repeat carrier for you that is going to be willing to do continued loads in the future. There's all different scenarios where like just the ethics come in, whether or not it's legal, what you have to do, you have to make an ethical decision.
Yeah. And I would say, again, the first thing is I would probably cut them some cash out of my pocket, like you said. Again, if all things are considered and we're understand this correctly. The other thing I'm going to do before I even do that, though, is call my customer and try to understand what is actually happening there. Is it a one-off situation? Did a machine break? Did something happen that caused this congestion that day? Or is this something that happens every day that this is an issue? And ask them like, hey, how are you handling this? Because the likelihood is if this is happening every day, that's probably the reason they're probably looking for other brokers because they're just turning through carriers and brokers because they can't fix this problem themselves. So they're just using whoever work with them. But if it is a one-off, they'll usually split it with you. And that's usually what I'll offer. I'm like, hey, can I split this with you or something? And I don't mind even taking it out of my own pocket. I just want to know, is this going to happen every time we send a truck? What are we doing to try to alleviate this? Is everybody showing up at the same time for some reason? Like really understanding. So again, back to the episode for anybody who listened to this last week we did with Pardeep is find solutions, right? Understand what's happening so that you can make suggestions on how to maybe alleviate this in the future or how to get over it the next time. Because a one-off, you're $50 an hour. Maybe you're going to cut another $200. It shouldn't tank you for the week. But do the right thing when the carrier did what you asked of them, showed up when they said they would, and you're going to try to beat them because that's a half a day's work, right? Like that they just sat there and they're only asking for a couple $100. Like to me, you got to make it right if you want to be ethical.
Lastly, make sure your ducks are in a row because the one thing I just caught here, 4 hours delay, but they want 5.5 hours detention.
Well, I think it was a 4 hour delay and then an hour and a half inside.
Okay. All right. But either way, what you want to make sure is, was there wait time inside the facility? Were they actually there 4 hours before, according to GPS? Just make sure you double and triple check everything. The old adage, trust but verify, right?
Yep.
Make sure, because you could just be getting scammed out of money by a bad actor if you don't double check this stuff.
Yes.
So. All right. Last question. Ed asks, does posting a load with different cities really increase your chances? Short answer, it can.
Can also
it also could hurt you. But if to explain what this is, right? If let's say a common way that I've seen this is, let's say there's a load picking up in Orchard Park, New York, right? People might not know, but that's a suburb of Buffalo.
Yep.
If a carrier sees a load, Orchard Park, New York, they think, New York, I don't want to go to the city. But if I write Buffalo as an alternative city, now they know, okay, well, that's 6 hours away from New York City. I'm not having to go through the boroughs and handle all that craziness. So that's one way where it tends to work good, in my opinion. Where it can hurt you is if you post in a city that's maybe 20 miles away, if that actually puts a carrier out of where, like, in the wrong direction of where they thought they were going to, it could really piss them off.
Yes.
So, like if they're like, all right, I have to deadhead 25 miles to this location, and then they find out, oh, I have to deadhead 50 miles. That could be could kind of sting you there. What's your thought on the posting different cities?
So now, and there's a few different things. So one is if you've got a load picking up in somewhere that has no trucks, right? Let's just say you've got an odd pickup in the middle of the country where there's literally no trucks. Like every time you look at this on DAT or truck stop, there's just no trucks there, right? So when you have that scenario, posting a load out of there isn't going to help you. So you do have to find the closest areas where there are trucks available. I will then post the loads out of there, right? But as soon as I'm getting the phone calls, what I'm going to say is the truth. Hey, look, I know you called on the Phoenix post. My load is actually picking up farther from where you are, but I'm willing to pay you deadhead if you like the destination. And I'll factor in the deadhead on my rate per mile, whatever it is, call $2 a mile for round numbers. If there's 200 miles from where I posted it, the first thing I'm saying to this carrier is, hey, look, the destination's correct. The pickup is going to have some deadhead mileage in it, but I'll pay you for it, right? So the rate isn't from that city. And I know I've got to pay to get that truck to my pickup anyway, because that's a trick on how you can get capacity in an area that doesn't have capacity. Now, if you're just trying to use the load boards to just put other things in there to just try to get people to call you, you're going to irritate more people than it's usually going to help you. You're going to create more phone calls of people that don't want what you have anyway. So it's not really that productive. Except, and the only time I ever really see this work is drivers tend to not want to go backwards for whatever reason. So if you got to pick up from like, I don't know, Kansas to New York, right? If you post that load that is a little outside of it and it goes through that city, the carriers will be willing to run dead to pick it up to keep going west or east, right? But if you say, hey, it's posted in Kansas, you got to drive 150 miles west and then go east, they're going to tell you to F off and never want to talk to you again.
Yep.
So
last thing I'll add on this is like, do it ethically. Like you said, you're going to tell them up front. I have seen somebody like do it in front of me and I was like, this is so dirty, where he basically had it was a one pick, one drop, but he called it he said there was a third stop in there, and he gets the driver on board with it. And then he calls and was like, hey, they canceled that first stop. You're just going to go right to stop number 2. And he's like, but I'll keep the same rate there for you. Almost trying to make it sound like he's doing him an attaboy. But the reality is he was lying the whole time. I'm like, you're going to get burnt eventually if you're unethical like that. So
yes, it's going to come back and get you.
Good questions, though. You got some final thoughts here today, Ben. What do you got for us?
Yeah, I saw this actually it's sent in a newsletter I really liked, and the title of it was "Because We've Always Done It That Way," and it says 4 feet 8.5 inches. But why? So the story starts out, and we'll add this to the newsletter for people to read it in its entirety. But it's like, if you look at all of the railroads in the United States, the rail to rail distance is 4 feet 8.5 inches, right? And if you ask somebody like why that is that way, because it's a really odd number, right? 4 feet 8.5 inches. Well, the people that designed the railroads in the US were originally from England. And the reason they used to design them in England was because when they designed the railroads, they designed them at the same width that they designed buggies. And buggy wheels were actually 4 feet 8.5 inches wide. And the reason they designed buggies with wheels that were 4 feet 8.5 inches wide was because if they made them any wider or any narrower, they broke. And the reason they broke was because the ruts in the English roads are exactly that distance apart. And the reason the ruts in English roads are that way is because when the Romans built the roads into there thousands of years ago, that's the way the chariots ran. And the interesting thing is why the chariots actually are that far apart is because that's how many horses wide. So literally railroad tracks, right, are that distance because of 2 horses' asses. But the funny thing in the article was it goes all the way full circle and it goes, okay, so the rockets that literally just went off in NASA and Cape Canaveral to go into space, they're designed in Utah. Well, to ship them from Utah to Cape Canaveral, they go on a train, and that train goes through a tunnel, and that tunnel is just a little bit wider than that. So the most advanced engineering transportation vehicle on the planet is still constricted by 4 feet, 8.5 inches. They can't make the rockets any wider because they won't fit through the tunnels on the train. So literally, the rockets we put into space are still constrained by the roads that were developed by the Romans thousands of years ago. And every time I hear, we were talking about larger companies and 3PLs, and we've always done it this way, it just made me laugh when I read this, because like, here is a great example of modern day aviation, right? Like literally still being designed in some way to the specifications of what we did thousands of years ago in a society that doesn't even exist anymore.
It's wild.
And it just, to me, made me laugh. And I was like,
yeah, challenge the status quo, man. I'm all for it. I'm always all for it. So good stuff. Good episode. Make sure to continue to send us all of your questions. And again, please, to support the channel, check out our sponsors down in the show notes under recommended products. And Ben, what do you got for us?
Whether you believe you can or believe you can't, you're right.
And until next time, go Bills.